In the silence between what was written and what was erased, between the monuments that stand tall and the foundations deliberately buried beneath desert sands, lies the weight of deliberate forgetting. History breathes not only in the stories we celebrate, but in the deeper shadows cast by those who chose what would survive and what would vanish. Beneath every civilization's golden narrative runs an underground river of suppressed truth, flowing through hidden chambers where scribes once burned scrolls by royal decree, where archaeologists were paid to look away, where entire peoples were edited from existence with the stroke of a censor's pen. Tonight, we descend into those forgotten spaces where silence was purchased, where memory was murdered, where the powerful rewrote reality itself. These are the stories they hoped would never surface again, whispered now in the darkness as you drift towards sleep. If this journey into history gently moves you, take a second to like, share, and subscribe. It helps more sleepy minds find their way here. By the way, where in the world are you listening from? What time is it where you are? Drop a comment before you drift off. We read every single one. In the dying light of a Ptolemaic sunset, sometime in the 3rd century before the Common Era, a man named Demetrius of Phalerum walked the marble corridors of Alexandria's great library for what he did not yet know would be the final time. His sandals whispered against stone that had been polished by countless scholars, each footstep echoing through halls where the accumulated wisdom of the known world rested on papyrus scrolls, carefully catalogued and preserved. Demetrius had been the library's chief architect, its visionary guardian, the man who had convinced Ptolemy IX that knowledge itself could be the greatest treasure of any kingdom. Under his guidance, scribes had copied every manuscript that entered Alexandria's harbour, creating duplicates before returning originals to their owners. Scholars from across the Mediterranean had flocked to this beacon of learning, drawn by the promise of accessing texts that existed nowhere else on Earth. But tonight, as shadows lengthened across the library's reading rooms, Demetrius carried with him a scroll that would never be catalogued, would never be copied, would never be read by eager minds in centuries to come. The papyrus contained his final inventory, a secret census of knowledge that he had been ordered to compile by the new pharaoh, Ptolemy II. The younger Ptolemy had inherited more than a kingdom from his father. He had inherited a paranoia that knowledge, uncontrolled, could become a weapon against royal authority. Where his father had seen wisdom as power, the son saw it as threat, and so he had commanded Demetrius to create 2 inventories, one for public consumption, celebrating the library's treasures, and another that would remain hidden forever, listing those works that challenged royal legitimacy, questioned divine authority, or preserved memories that the new regime preferred forgotten. As Demetrius walked through the library's sections, his mind traced the invisible boundaries between permitted knowledge and forbidden truth. In the section devoted to Egyptian religious texts, entire shelves of scrolls detailed ancient rituals that predated the Ptolemaic dynasty, ceremonies that acknowledged older gods, older claims to divine kingship. These would be the first to disappear, quietly removed and transported to a warehouse beyond the city walls, where they would await destruction. In the philosophical wing, works by democratic theorists from Athens posed subtle challenges to monarchical rule. Treatises on natural governance, on the rights of citizens, on the accountability of rulers to their subjects, had been marked with small notations in Demetrius's careful script. These too would vanish, leaving future scholars with only fragments, partial quotations in later works, shadows of ideas that might have changed the world. The historical section presented perhaps the greatest challenge to royal comfort. Here lay chronicles that contradicted official narratives of conquest, accounts of resistance movements that painted Egyptian rebels not as treasonous rabble, but as patriots defending their homeland. Military treatises that analyzed the weaknesses of Macedonian tactics, ethnographic studies that celebrated the sophistication of cultures the Ptolemies claimed to have civilized, economic texts that questioned the sustainability of the kingdom's tax policies, all had been condemned to oblivion. But it was in the library's newest section, dedicated to works from the Indian subcontinent and the far reaches of the Persian Empire, that Demetrius encountered the materials that troubled him most deeply. Here were texts that described governmental systems so alien to Ptolemaic thinking that they seemed to come from different worlds entirely. Treatises on communal ownership, on consensus-based decision-making, on societies that had never known kings at all. One scroll in particular had captured Demetrius's attention during his months of secret cataloguing. Written by a traveling merchant who had spent years in the Mauryan Empire, it described a kingdom where the ruler's power was constrained by written laws, where councils of citizens could overrule royal decrees, where even the emperor was expected to justify his actions to assemblies of commoners. Such ideas, if they spread among Alexandria's intellectuals, could prove more dangerous to Ptolemaic rule than any army. As he completed his final survey, Demetrius understood that he was witnessing the birth of a new form of power, one that operated not through force of arms, but through control of memory itself. The Ptolemies had learned something that would be rediscovered by countless rulers throughout history, that to control the present, one must first control the past, and to control the past, one must control what people were allowed to remember. The actual removal began 3 nights later, under cover of darkness. Teams of workers, sworn to secrecy and paid handsomely for their silence, entered the library through side entrances, carrying empty carts that would not remain empty for long. They worked section by section, following Demetrius's secret inventory, carefully extracting scrolls that had been marked for elimination. The process was methodical, almost surgical in its precision. Where entire works were removed, scribes left carefully crafted forgeries in their place, scrolls that bore the same titles but contained edited versions of their contents. Treatises on democracy became celebrations of enlightened monarchy. Historical accounts of successful resistance movements were rewritten as cautionary tales about the futility of rebellion. Religious texts that acknowledged multiple paths to divine truth were altered to support the supremacy of official state gods. Some scrolls were too dangerous to risk even in edited form. These were removed entirely, their absence explained by fictional catalogue notes claiming they had been damaged beyond repair in an equally fictional warehouse fire. Future scholars, finding gaps in the library's collection, would assume that time and accident had claimed these works, never suspecting deliberate destruction. The most sensitive materials received special treatment. Rather than destruction, they were transported to a secret facility deep in the Egyptian desert, built specifically to house knowledge too dangerous for public consumption, but too valuable to destroy entirely. Here, in climate-controlled chambers guarded by priests sworn to absolute secrecy, the forbidden scrolls were preserved against some hypothetical future when they might prove useful to royal scholars or intelligence operatives. Demetrius himself, became the first casualty of this new approach to knowledge management. Within months of completing his secret inventory, he found himself quietly reassigned to a minor administrative position in Upper Egypt, far from Alexandria's intellectual circles. The official explanation spoke of the need for his expertise in provincial governance, but those few scholars who noticed his disappearance understood the true message, that curiosity itself had become a form of treason. The effects of this selective purging rippled outward through the intellectual community like stones dropped in still water. Scholars who had once eagerly shared controversial ideas began to self-censor, uncertain which thoughts might be considered dangerous. Visiting intellectuals from other kingdoms found themselves steered away from certain sections of the library, told that materials were temporarily unavailable or had been moved to restricted collections. Within a generation, the very concept of the library had been transformed. What had once been a repository of all human knowledge became a carefully curated collection designed to support specific political and religious orthodoxies. The great library of Alexandria remained great in size and reputation, but its soul had been quietly extracted, leaving behind a magnificent shell that served power rather than truth. Yet even as the Ptolemies congratulated themselves on their successful management of dangerous knowledge, the very act of suppression created new forms of resistance. Scholars began developing coded languages, embedding forbidden ideas within seemingly innocent texts. Underground networks formed to preserve and transmit banned works, copying them in secret and hiding them in private collections throughout the Greek world. Some of the most sophisticated resistance came from within the library itself. Loyal scribes, horrified by the systematic destruction of knowledge, began creating their own secret archives. Working at night, using materials purchased with their own funds, they copied forbidden texts onto scrolls that were then hidden in private homes, temples sympathetic to the cause of preservation, and caves in the surrounding desert. These underground librarians developed elaborate systems for disguising their activities. Forbidden texts were often copied onto scrolls that appeared to contain routine administrative documents or commercial correspondence. The real content would be written in invisible inks that only appeared when treated with specific chemicals, or encoded within seemingly random collections of numbers and symbols. The most ambitious of these preservation efforts was orchestrated by a network of scholars who called themselves the Keepers of the Light. Led by a mathematician named Apollodorus, who had been one of Demetrius's closest collaborators, they systematically created copies of every work that had been marked for destruction, organizing a shadow library that operated parallel to the official institution. Apollodorus and his fellow keepers understood that they were engaged in more than mere preservation. They were waging a war for the future of human consciousness itself. Every scroll they saved represented a victory against the forces that sought to limit human thought, to constrain the boundaries of the possible, to ensure that future generations would know only what their rulers wanted them to know. The network's most audacious project involved creating a complete duplicate of the Forbidden Archive, scrolls for scroll, housed in a cave complex in the cliffs south of Alexandria. Working over several years, teams of scribes copied thousands of banned texts, creating what they called the True Library, a repository of human knowledge unfiltered by political concerns. But such ambitious undertakings could not remain secret forever. Royal intelligence operatives, trained to watch for signs of intellectual resistance, began noticing patterns in the behavior of certain scholars, late-night meetings, unusual purchases of writing materials, coded messages passed between seemingly unconnected individuals, all pointed to the existence of some form of organized opposition to royal knowledge policies. The investigation that followed was conducted with the same methodical precision that had characterized the original purging of the library. Royal agents infiltrated scholarly circles, posed as sympathetic intellectuals, offered rewards for information about underground preservation activities. One by one, members of the Keeper network were identified, arrested, and quietly disappeared into royal dungeons. Apollodorus himself was captured while attempting to transport a particularly sensitive collection of scrolls to a safe house outside the city. Under interrogation, he revealed nothing about the location of the true library or the identities of his fellow keepers, accepting torture and eventual execution rather than betray the cause he had devoted his life to defending. The destruction of the Keeper network marked the end of organized resistance to royal knowledge control, but it could not undo what had already been accomplished. Hidden throughout Egypt and the broader Mediterranean world, secret collections of forbidden texts continued to exist, passed down through families of scholars, preserved in monastery archives, cached in caves and abandoned buildings. Some of these hidden libraries would survive for centuries, their existence known only to small circles of initiates who understood the importance of preserving knowledge against the ever-present threat of official suppression. Others would be lost to time, their locations forgotten when their guardians died without passing on the secret, leaving treasures of human thought buried in sand and silence. In the shadowed scriptorium of the monastery of San Lorenzo, deep in the mountains of northern Italy, Brother Marcus bent over his parchment as the autumn wind of 1347 rattled the shutters of his cell. The candle beside him flickered, casting dancing shadows across the page where he carefully copied the words of Augustine's Confessions, his practiced hand forming each letter with the precision born of decades devoted to the preservation of sacred texts. But tonight, hidden beneath the familiar Latin phrases of the saint's spiritual autobiography, Marcus inscribed another text entirely. Using an ancient technique known only to a select few among the monastery's scribes, he employed invisible inks derived from plant extracts, writing between the lines of Augustine's approved text, a chronicle that would have cost him his life, if discovered by the wrong eyes. Marcus was one of the last members of a secret tradition that stretched back through centuries of monastic life, a brotherhood within the brotherhood that had dedicated itself to preserving truths that the church hierarchy had declared too dangerous for mortal minds to contemplate. They called themselves the Custodes Veritatis, the guardians of truth, and their hidden writings contained some of the most explosive secrets in Christendom. The text that Marcus copied that night was a detailed account of the Council of Nicaea, but not the sanitized version that appeared in official church histories. This was the testimony of Josias of Cordoba, one of the council's organizers, written in his final years when guilt and the proximity of death had loosened his tongue. It described in unflinching detail how political considerations had shaped fundamental Christian doctrines, how emperors had influenced theological debates, how dissenting voices had been silenced not through divine revelation, but through very earthly threats and bribes. According to Josias's secret testimony, the famous unanimity of the Council of Nicaea had been achieved through methods that had more in common with imperial politics than spiritual discernment. Bishops who questioned the emerging orthodoxy found their dioceses threatened with loss of imperial support. Scholars who presented alternative interpretations of Scripture discovered that their writings were being confiscated and destroyed. Some of the most learned theologians of the age had been effectively silenced through promises of preferment for compliance or threats of exile for resistance. The document that Marcus copied also contained detailed descriptions of texts that had been deliberately excluded from the biblical canon, not for theological reasons, but because they contained ideas that emperors and bishops found politically inconvenient. Gospels that emphasized the spiritual equality of all believers, regardless of social status. Epistles that questioned the accumulation of wealth by religious institutions. Revelatory texts that suggested divine truth could be accessed directly by individuals without the mediation of priestly hierarchies. As Marcus worked through the night, transcribing these dangerous truths onto parchment that would later be hidden behind false walls in the monastery's deepest vaults, he thought about the generations of scribes who had preceded him in this clandestine calling. Each had risked everything to preserve knowledge that powerful forces had sought to erase, understanding that truth, once lost, might never be recovered. The tradition had begun in the earliest centuries of Christianity, when competing interpretations of Christ's message had created dozens of different communities, each with their own gospels, their own understanding of divine will. As imperial favor settled upon one particular branch of Christianity, the others found themselves not merely out of favor, but actively persecuted, their texts confiscated and burned, their leaders arrested or forced into exile. Some of these persecuted communities had seen the approaching storm and taken steps to preserve their sacred writings. Working in secret, often in hidden chambers beneath their churches or in caves far from Roman settlements, scribes had created copies of their most precious texts, hoping that future generations might rediscover truths that were being systematically eliminated from official Christian memory. The monastery of San Lorenzo had been built unknowingly atop one of these ancient hiding places. When the foundations were being laid in the 8th century, workers had discovered a chamber filled with carefully preserved scrolls and codices written in Greek, Latin, Coptic, and other ancient languages. The abbot of that time, a man of unusual intellectual curiosity named Benedict the Learned, had recognized the historical importance of these documents and made the fateful decision to preserve them rather than destroy them as heretical materials. Benedict had also made an equally fateful decision to keep the discovery secret from church authorities, understanding instinctively that these texts contain truths that would be considered dangerous by those who had shaped Orthodox Christianity. He selected a small group of the monastery's most trusted and learned monks to study the documents and establish the tradition of the Custodes Veritatis to ensure their preservation. Over the centuries that followed, the secret collection had grown as each generation of guardians added new discoveries to the hidden archive. Traveling monks, aware of the monastery's reputation for preserving ancient texts, had sometimes brought forbidden documents for safekeeping. Scholars fleeing. Persecution had arrived at San Lorenzo's gates, carrying precious manuscripts that contained ideas too dangerous to possess openly. Some of the most extraordinary additions to the collection had come from the Islamic world, where Christian, Jewish, and Muslim scholars had preserved texts that had been lost in Christian Europe. During the Crusades, despite the official hostility between the faiths, some guardians had established secret contacts with Islamic libraries, arranging for copies of important documents to be smuggled back to San Lorenzo. Brother Marcus himself had been initiated into the Custodes Veritatis 15 years earlier, chosen because of his exceptional skill as a scribe, and his reputation for absolute discretion. The initiation ceremony had taken place in the monastery's deepest vault, surrounded by centuries of accumulated forbidden knowledge, as Marcus swore a sacred oath to preserve truth regardless of the personal cost. On that night, 15 years ago, the elderly brother Thomas, who had served as the Guardian's leader for nearly 4 decades, had shown Marcus documents that had challenged everything he thought he knew about Christian history. Letters between early church fathers that revealed their doubts about fundamental doctrines, records of theological debates that had been excised from official histories, accounts of persecutions directed not at pagans, but at fellow Christians, whose only crime had been interpreting Scripture differently. Perhaps most shocking of all had been a collection of documents relating to the historical Jesus himself, not the sanitized accounts that appeared in approved Gospels, but testimonies from his contemporaries that painted a more complex picture of a religious teacher whose message had been gradually transformed by his followers to serve the needs of growing institutional power. These documents suggested that Jesus had been part of a broader Jewish reform movement, working alongside other teachers and healers who shared his vision of spiritual renewal. Some texts indicated that he had been married, had traveled far more widely than official accounts suggested, had been influenced by religious traditions from India and Persia that had reached Palestine through trade routes. Most controversial of all were documents that suggested Jesus had survived the crucifixion, living for several more years and continuing to teach a small group of devoted followers. These accounts described a very different resurrection than the one celebrated in Orthodox Christianity, presenting it not as a supernatural event, but as the recovery of a man who had been mistakenly presumed dead. Brother Thomas had explained to Marcus that the Guardians did not necessarily believe everything contained in their hidden collection, but they preserved it all because they understood that truth was complex, multifaceted, and too important to be shaped by political considerations. Future generations, they believed, should have access to all the evidence and be allowed to draw their own conclusions about the nature of spiritual reality. As Marcus completed his copying of Hosius's testimony and carefully sealed the invisible text with a special preparation that would make it undetectable to casual observation, he reflected on the weight of responsibility that came with membership in the Custodes Veritatis. Every document he preserved might someday change the world's understanding of its own spiritual heritage. Every secret he kept might be the key to unlocking truths that had been buried for centuries. But he also understood the dangers that came with such knowledge. The Church's Inquisition had been growing more powerful and more ruthless with each passing decade, and its investigators had developed increasingly sophisticated methods for detecting heretical activities. Already, several monasteries in France and Germany had been investigated on suspicion of harboring forbidden texts, and their libraries had been subjected to thorough searches by officials trained to recognize signs of clandestine scholarship. The Guardians at San Lorenzo had developed elaborate precautions to protect their secret collection. The hidden chamber that housed the forbidden texts was accessible only through a concealed entrance behind the monastery's wine cellar, requiring knowledge of a specific sequence of stone manipulations to open. The documents themselves were stored in specially prepared containers that would protect them from moisture, fire, and other threats to their preservation. More sophisticated still were the methods used to disguise the Guardians' scholarly activities. When working with forbidden texts, they always had approved manuscripts nearby, ready to be substituted if unexpected visitors arrived. They developed codes and ciphers for communicating with each other about sensitive matters, embedding messages within ordinary monastery correspondence about supplies, schedules, and routine religious observances. The most elaborate deception involved the creation of false walls and hidden compartments throughout the monastery, spaces where individual documents could be quickly concealed if searches became necessary. Some of these hiding places were so cleverly constructed that they appeared to be solid stone, yet could be opened by those who knew the secret mechanisms. As dawn approached, and Marcus prepared to return the Hosius testimony to its hiding place, he thought about the future of the Custodes Veritatis tradition. The world was changing rapidly, and he sensed that the age of monasteries and their carefully guarded secrets might be drawing to a close. New forms of learning were emerging, new ways of preserving and transmitting knowledge that might make their clandestine methods obsolete. Yet he also recognized that, as long as powerful institutions sought to control truth for their own purposes, there would be a need for individuals willing to preserve what others sought to destroy. The specific forms might change, but the essential mission of the Guardians would continue, carried forward by new generations of scholars who understood that knowledge, once lost, might never be recovered. As he extinguished his candle and prepared for the brief sleep that remained before morning prayers, Marcus offered a silent prayer not to the official saints of the church calendar, but to all those unnamed scribes and scholars who had risked everything to preserve truth in the face of institutional pressure to forget. Their sacrifice had made his own work possible, and he hoped that someday, when the world was ready, their hidden gifts to future generations would finally see the light of day. The morning bells of San Lorenzo had begun to ring across the valley, calling the brothers to prayer, but in the hidden chamber beneath the monastery, centuries of forbidden knowledge waited in patient silence, preserved against an uncertain future by those who understood that truth, like faith itself, required its own form of devotion. The weight of forgotten knowledge pressed down upon the dusty shelves like autumn leaves gathering in corners where no wind could reach them. In monasteries scattered across medieval Europe, monks had spent their lives not just preserving knowledge, but deciding what deserved to survive and what should fade into blessed oblivion. Brother Thomas of Cluny knew this burden well as he stood before a manuscript that would never see morning light again. The year was 1348, and the Black Death had already claimed a third of Europe's population. In the scriptorium of Cluny Abbey, Brother Thomas held in his trembling hands a treatise on advanced surgical techniques written by Islamic physicians 3 centuries earlier. The text described procedures for cataract removal, methods for treating compound fractures, and theories about blood circulation that would not be discovered in Europe for another 300 years. Thomas had translated enough Arabic to understand what he held. This knowledge could save lives, could ease suffering, could revolutionize medical practice across Christendom, and yet, as he touched the parchment with fingers stained by decades of copying scripture, he knew it would burn with the evenings. Refuse. The church had spoken. Islamic learning was suspect. To preserve this would be to invite questions about faith, about authority, about the very foundations upon which medieval society rested. The fire that consumed that manuscript was not unique. Across Europe, countless works of Islamic science, Greek philosophy, and local folk medicine disappeared into flames, buried beneath the weight of religious orthodoxy and cultural prejudice. What might have been was sacrificed for what was deemed appropriate to be. But Brother Thomas was not alone in his quiet rebellion. In Baghdad, even as the Mongols approached in 1258, the librarians of the House of Wisdom were making similar choices. They buried the most precious texts in lead-lined boxes, hiding them beneath mosque foundations and in desert caves. They knew the flames were coming, knew that Hulagu Khan's armies would show no mercy to books any more than to people. When the Mongols finally breached Baghdad's walls, the Tigris River ran black with ink for days. Manuscripts floated like autumn leaves on water that had once nourished the world's greatest center of learning. Soldiers used mathematical treatises to kindle their cooking fires. Philosophical texts became fodder for their horses. Poetry that had moved hearts for generations dissolved in the muddy waters where it fell. Yet beneath the destruction, in hidden chambers that would not be discovered for 7 centuries, lay a treasure trove of human knowledge. The librarians had selected carefully Euclid's complete works on geometry, Ptolemy's detailed astronomical observations, Al-Khwarizmi's revolutionary mathematical concepts, medical texts describing treatments that European physicians would not understand until the Renaissance, maps showing lands that officially did not exist in the medieval imagination. The concealment was deliberate, systematic, profound. They buried not just books, but entire world views, ways of thinking about mathematics that saw patterns invisible to contemporary minds, philosophical approaches to existence that challenged fundamental assumptions about reality, scientific methods that prioritized observation over received wisdom. Centuries later, when archaeologists finally uncovered these chambers, they would struggle to explain how such advanced knowledge could have existed so early. Rather than celebrate the sophisticated thinking of medieval Islamic scholars, academic institutions often downplayed the discoveries, suggesting that earlier dating must be incorrect, or that the knowledge represented isolated anomalies rather than systematic advancement. The burial of knowledge was not limited to dramatic conquests and religious conflicts. Sometimes the most profound concealments happened quietly, through the simple passage of time and the gradual shift of cultural values. In the libraries of Timbuktu, scholars faced a different kind of erasure as trade routes shifted and political power moved elsewhere. The manuscripts of Timbuktu contained African history that contradicted European assumptions about the continent's past. They described vast trading networks, sophisticated governmental systems, and intellectual achievements that challenged colonial narratives about African capability and development. As European influence grew in the region, these manuscripts became increasingly dangerous to their owners. Families began burying the books in the sand, hiding them in secret rooms, sealing them away from prying eyes that might misinterpret or deliberately distort their contents. They knew that in the wrong hands, these texts could be used to justify colonial exploitation or dismissed as forgeries that supported European prejudices. The decision to hide this knowledge was made by ordinary people who understood that sometimes preservation requires concealment. A merchant named Abdul Rahman bin Mahmud carefully wrapped legal texts in oiled leather and buried them beneath his family's compound in 1591 as Moroccan forces approached Timbuktu. His grandson would retrieve them 60 years later, but by then the political climate had changed so completely that the knowledge seemed to belong to another world entirely. These buried histories reveal a pattern that extends far beyond any single culture or time period. Knowledge becomes dangerous when it challenges existing power structures, threatens established narratives, or suggests alternative ways of organizing society. The response, again and again, has been burial, literal or metaphorical. In Renaissance, Italy, the complete works of Lucretius lay hidden for decades because his materialist philosophy contradicted Christian doctrine. The manuscripts existed, scholars knew of them, but they remained locked away in private collections, studied in secret, discussed only in whispered conversations among trusted friends. When Poggio Bracciolini finally brought Lucretius's On the Nature of Things to broader attention in 1417, it ignited intellectual controversies that lasted for generations. The text suggested that atoms formed the basis of all matter, that gods did not intervene in human affairs, that death was simply the dissolution of atomic combinations. Such ideas were revolutionary, dangerous, potentially heretical. The Church initially attempted to suppress the work entirely, but the printing press had made suppression nearly impossible. Instead, they chose a more subtle approach: interpretation. Scholars sympathetic to church doctrine provided commentaries that neutralized Lucretius's most challenging concepts, transforming radical philosophy into acceptable academic exercise. This pattern of controlled revelation would repeat throughout history. Knowledge that could not be destroyed was often filtered, contextualized, or reinterpreted until its original power was safely contained. The burial became metaphorical, but no less effective. The Underground Railroad of hidden knowledge had many stations, and its conductors often worked without knowing they were part of a larger network. In 16th century Prague, Rabbi Judah Loew ben Bezalel carefully transcribed Kabbalistic texts that explored cosmological concepts remarkably similar to modern quantum mechanics. These manuscripts described reality as composed of interconnected energy patterns, suggested that consciousness played a fundamental role in shaping physical phenomena, and outlined meditation techniques for accessing hidden dimensions of existence. Rabbi Loew understood the danger these ideas represented. In a Europe consumed by religious warfare and intellectual orthodoxy, such concepts could easily be misinterpreted as sorcery or heresy. He encoded the most sensitive teachings in complex symbolic language, scattered key concepts across multiple texts, and created a network of trusted students who memorized different portions of the complete system. When Rabbi Loew died in 1609, much of his advanced knowledge died with him. The manuscripts remained, but without the oral traditions that explained their deeper meanings, they became puzzles that later scholars could not fully solve. The burial here was not physical, but pedagogical. Knowledge hidden within plain sight, protected by layers of symbolism that only initiates could penetrate. Similar patterns emerged across cultures and centuries. In China, Taoist alchemists developed proto-scientific theories about atomic structures and chemical processes, but encoded their discoveries in mystical language that protected them from political persecution. In India, Vedantic philosophers explored mathematical concepts that would not be formally recognized in Europe for another 1,000 years, but preserved them in religious texts that appeared to deal only with spiritual matters. The genius of these concealment strategies lay in their recognition that ideas could survive persecution if they wore appropriate disguises. Religious mysticism provided perfect camouflage for scientific speculation. Poetic metaphor could preserve precise observations about natural phenomena. Mythological narratives could encode historical events too dangerous to record directly. In medieval Ireland, the bards faced a similar challenge when English occupation threatened to destroy Gaelic culture entirely. They could not prevent the conquest of their lands, but they could attempt to preserve their people's memory. The solution was elegant in its simplicity. They buried their history in songs. The Irish bardic tradition had always been oral, But under English rule, it became something more. A vast underground library of cultural memory that could not be burned because it existed only in human minds. Songs that appeared to be simple entertainment actually preserved detailed genealogies, legal precedents, territorial boundaries, and historical events stretching back centuries. Turlough O'Carolan, the great harper who lived from 1670 to 1738, composed melodies that secretly encoded the locations of hidden manuscripts, the names of displaced families, and the dates of suppressed uprisings. A traveling musician could carry an entire library of forbidden knowledge across the countryside without arousing suspicion, spreading information through performances that seemed to offer nothing more than pleasant diversion. The English authorities eventually recognized the subversive potential of Irish music and attempted to suppress it, but by then the tradition had become so thoroughly embedded in the culture that elimination would have required destroying the people themselves. The knowledge had achieved a form of immortality through dispersal, becoming part of the living memory of an entire population. This pattern of cultural preservation, through apparently innocuous mediums, appeared across the globe wherever indigenous peoples faced colonial suppression. Native American tribes encoded astronomical observations in beadwork patterns, preserved agricultural knowledge in pottery designs, and maintained historical records through seemingly decorative textile traditions. The Incan quipu system represented perhaps the most sophisticated example of this approach. To Spanish conquistadors, the knotted strings appeared to be primitive record-keeping devices used for basic accounting. In reality, the quipu encoded complex historical narratives, legal codes, astronomical calculations, and administrative procedures that maintained the function of a vast empire. When the Spanish banned quipu usage in 1583, claiming it facilitated pagan communication, they effectively destroyed a library containing thousands of years of accumulated knowledge. But some quipu masters continued working in secret, creating simplified versions that could pass casual inspection while preserving essential information for future generations. The burial of indigenous knowledge systems had profound consequences that extended far beyond the immediate cultures affected. Agricultural techniques developed over millennia disappeared overnight, taking with them understanding of sustainable farming practices that modern science struggles to reconstruct. Medical knowledge accumulated through generations of careful observation vanished, along with treatments for diseases that continue to challenge contemporary physicians. Perhaps most tragically, entire ways of thinking about humanity's relationship with the natural world were lost. Indigenous peoples had developed sophisticated ecological philosophies that understood environmental interconnections centuries before European science recognized such concepts. These worldviews could have provided crucial guidance for managing the industrial transformation of the planet, but they were buried beneath assumptions about primitive thinking and civilized progress. In the age of exploration, maps became instruments of power, and the most dangerous maps were those that revealed too much truth. The Piri Reis map of 1513 showed Antarctica with disturbing accuracy, depicting coastlines that would not be officially discovered for another 3 centuries. The Turkish admiral who created it claimed to have based his work on ancient sources, including maps used by Christopher Columbus himself. When copies of the Piri Reis map reached European courts, they created a crisis of understanding. How could ancient cartographers have possessed knowledge that contemporary explorers were only beginning to acquire? The implications challenged fundamental assumptions about human progress, suggesting that earlier civilizations might have achieved technological capabilities that exceeded current understanding. The solution was elegant and devastating. The maps were declared curiosities, filed away in private collections, and gradually forgotten by mainstream scholarship. Alternative explanations were developed. The accuracy was coincidental. The coastlines represented different regions entirely. The ancient sources were mythical rather than factual. But the burial of inconvenient cartography extended far beyond single mysterious maps. Throughout the colonial period, indigenous maps were systematically suppressed because they revealed territorial claims that conflicted with European ambitions. Native American tribes had created sophisticated cartographic traditions that recorded land ownership, resource locations, and territorial boundaries with remarkable precision. These maps posed a direct threat to colonial land acquisition strategies. If indigenous peoples could demonstrate detailed geographical knowledge and establish territorial claims, European conquest became legally and morally problematic. The solution was to deny the validity of indigenous cartography entirely, declaring that primitive peoples could not create accurate maps and therefore had no legitimate claim to detailed territorial knowledge. The buried maps revealed a devastating truth. Indigenous peoples often possessed geographical knowledge superior to that of their conquerors. Native guides led European explorers through territories that existed in perfect detail on hidden maps created generations earlier. River systems, mountain passes, and resource locations that Europeans struggled to discover had been common knowledge in indigenous communities for centuries. In Australia, Aboriginal songlines created the world's most sophisticated navigation system, encoding precise geographical information in oral traditions that could guide travelers across thousands of miles of seemingly featureless terrain. Each song described specific landmarks, water sources, and territorial boundaries, creating a living map that covered the entire continent. When European settlers arrived, they dismissed the songlines as primitive superstition, failing to recognize that they represented a cartographic achievement unmatched by contemporary European science. The burial of this knowledge had tragic consequences, as settlers repeatedly became lost in territories that Aboriginal people navigated with effortless precision. The systematic suppression of indigenous geographical knowledge represented one of history's greatest intellectual crimes. Entire continents' worth of accumulated wisdom about terrain, climate, resources, and navigation disappeared beneath European assumptions about cultural superiority. Generations of careful observation and systematic knowledge accumulation were dismissed as primitive folklore. Similar patterns emerged in the realm of astronomical observation. Islamic astronomers had created star charts of extraordinary accuracy, tracked planetary movements with mathematical precision, and developed theories about celestial mechanics that would not be surpassed in Europe for centuries. When these works finally reached European courts, they were often attributed to classical Greek sources rather than acknowledged as Islamic achievements. The Alphonsine tables, compiled in 13th century Spain, represented a culmination of Islamic astronomical knowledge. They provided accurate predictions of planetary positions, eclipse timing, and seasonal variations that surpassed anything available in contemporary European scholarship. Yet when these tables were distributed throughout Europe, their Islamic origins were systematically obscured, and credit was given to earlier Greek astronomers or contemporary European scholars. This pattern of cultural appropriation combined with intellectual burial created a distorted understanding of human intellectual development. Revolutionary discoveries were separated from their cultural contexts, attributed to acceptable sources. and integrated into European scholarship without acknowledgement of their actual origins. The consequences extended far beyond academic pride. By denying the intellectual achievements of non-European cultures, European scholarship created artificial limitations on its own development. Islamic mathematical concepts could have accelerated European scientific progress by centuries if they had been acknowledged and built upon, rather than buried and rediscovered. Chinese innovations in metallurgy, engineering, and navigation could have transformed European technology if cultural prejudices had not prevented systematic knowledge transfer. Indian advances in medicine, mathematics, and astronomy could have enriched European understanding if they had been studied rather than dismissed as primitive mysticism. The burial of knowledge thus became self-defeating, impoverishing the very cultures that considered themselves superior while simultaneously destroying irreplaceable human achievements. The underground libraries of hidden wisdom represented not just lost information, but lost opportunities for human advancement that might have prevented centuries of unnecessary suffering and ignorance. In the quiet hours before dawn, when Brother Thomas had stood before his fire, he could not have imagined the full consequences of his choice. The manuscript that burned contained not just medical knowledge, but a way of thinking about human healing that might have prevented countless deaths from preventable diseases. The philosophical approaches to natural observation that disappeared with that text might have accelerated scientific revolution by generations, yet Thomas made his choice with full knowledge of its implications, understanding that in a world where knowledge could be dangerous, preservation sometimes required sacrifice, and wisdom sometimes demanded silence. The underground library of buried histories bears witness to countless such choices, each one a small tragedy that collectively represents one of humanity's greatest losses. The shadows lengthened across the manuscript pages, carrying with them secrets that would sleep for centuries before finding their way back into the light of human understanding. And in those shadows, other stories waited their turn to emerge from the depths, where deliberate forgetting had placed them, ready to reveal how much of human achievement had been hidden away, waiting for the right moment to resurface and reclaim its place in the ongoing narrative of human knowledge. The imperial scribes worked through the winter nights of 1453, their quills scratching across parchment in the dying candlelight of Constantinople's final days. They knew the city would fall to Mehmed's cannons, could hear the Ottoman artillery testing its range against the Theodosian walls that had protected the last remnant of Rome for 1,000 years. But these men and women were not recording the siege. They were burying the truth about the empire's greatest scandal, the systematic persecution and execution of thousands of scholars, mystics, and free thinkers who would dare to challenge orthodox doctrine during the reign of John VIII, Palaiologos. In the basement archives of the Hagia Sophia, beneath stones that had witnessed the glory of Justinian and the prayers of Constantine, the scribes carefully packaged manuscripts that would never see daylight. These were not the glorious chronicles of military victories or theological treatises that filled the public libraries. These were the testimonies of the disappeared, intellectuals who had proposed that perhaps the earth was not the center of God's creation, physicians who had dissected human corpses to understand anatomy, mathematicians who had calculated the movements of stars with forbidden precision. The most dangerous documents bore the seal of Anakomnenos, the brilliant historian whose 12th century writings had been partially destroyed and buried for their unflinching criticism of the Crusades and their devastating impact on Byzantine society. Her hidden manuscripts revealed that the First Crusade had not been the glorious Christian endeavor depicted in Western chronicles. but a catastrophic invasion that had permanently weakened the empire. She had documented how Crusader armies had looted Byzantine cities, raped Christian women, and murdered Orthodox priests with the same enthusiasm they showed for fighting Muslims. Anna's suppressed writings described the horror of watching Latin soldiers destroy centuries of scholarship in Constantinople's libraries, burning manuscripts they could not read, and melting down golden religious artifacts for coin. She had recorded the names of scholars executed by Crusader commanders for possessing Arabic translations of Greek philosophical works, men condemned as heretics for studying the very foundation texts of their own civilization through the lens of Islamic scholarship. The scribes of 1453 understood that these truths were too dangerous for the Christian world to acknowledge. The Catholic Church had spent centuries justifying the Crusades as holy wars, and the Orthodox Church had developed its own mythologies about the period. To reveal that the Crusades had been a disaster for Eastern Christianity, that they had accelerated rather than slowed Byzantine decline, would undermine the fundamental narratives both churches used to legitimize their authority. Among the hidden documents was the complete testimony of Michael Choniates, Archbishop of Athens during the Fourth Crusade of 1204. His eyewitness account of the sack of Constantinople painted a picture so horrifying that it had been systematically suppressed for 2.5 centuries. Choniates described how Crusader soldiers had defiled the altar of Hagia Sophia with wine and prostitutes, how they had melted down the golden iconostasis to pay their debts, how they had tortured Orthodox priests to death for refusing to acknowledge papal supremacy. Most damning of all, Choniates had documented the role played by Venetian merchants in orchestrating the entire catastrophe. His hidden writings revealed that the Fourth Crusade had never been intended to reach the Holy Land at all. It had been a carefully planned commercial operation designed to eliminate Byzantine competition in Mediterranean trade. The supposed religious war had been nothing more than an elaborate corporate takeover, orchestrated by Doge Enrico Dandolo and financed by Venetian banking houses that would profit enormously from Constantinople's destruction. The scribes worked with practiced efficiency, understanding that each document they sealed away represented not just dangerous knowledge, but the death of individuals who had possessed that knowledge. The lists of the executed read like a roll call of Byzantine intellectual life: philosophers, astronomers, physicians, historians, poets, and theologians whose only crime had been thinking too freely about God, nature, and human society. By dawn, the most sensitive materials had been sealed in bronze containers and lowered into hidden chambers beneath the Hagia Sophia's foundation stones. Other documents were divided among trusted monasteries throughout Anatolia and the Peloponnese, communities whose abbots had sworn sacred oaths to preserve the materials without reading them. The scribes themselves drank poison at sunrise, ensuring that even under torture, they could never reveal the locations of their buried treasures. The smoke rose from Cordoba's courtyards for 3 days in December 1499, carrying with it the accumulated wisdom of 8 centuries of Islamic civilization in Spain. Cardinal Francisco Jiménez de Cisneros watched from the cathedral steps as his soldiers fed manuscript after manuscript to the flames, their Arabic calligraphy curling into ash before the winter winds scattered it across the city's ancient stones. The cardinal's face showed no emotion as he supervised the destruction of what may have been the largest collection of scientific and philosophical works in medieval Europe. But what the crowds gathered in the plaza did not know was that this spectacular burning was largely theatre. The most valuable manuscripts, the original works of Averroes and Avem Passé, the complete medical texts of Al-Zahrawi, the astronomical calculations of al-Battani, the philosophical commentaries that had shaped Christian scholasticism for centuries, had been secretly transported to hidden libraries days before the public burning began. The operation had been planned by a secret network of Christian scholars who understood what Europe was about to lose. Men like Cardinal Cisneros might burn books for political effect, but they were not fools. They recognized that Islamic scholarship had preserved and expanded upon Greek learning in ways that Christian Europe was only beginning to understand. To destroy these works entirely would be to cripple European intellectual development for generations. The hidden libraries were scattered throughout Spain's most remote monasteries and private estates, places where powerful families had quietly converted to Christianity, but retained their appreciation for scholarship regardless of its religious origins. The Mendoza family had constructed a false wall in their castle near Guadalajara, behind which they preserved the complete works of the Córdoba Medical School. The Duke of Alba had excavated chambers beneath his palace chapel, where he stored the mathematical treatises that had made Islamic Spain the most advanced center of learning in medieval Europe. Most significantly, the Archbishop of Toledo had arranged for the preservation of the legendary library of Al-Hakam II, the 10th century caliph, whose personal collection had numbered over 400,000 volumes. This library had been the heart of Córdoba's intellectual life, containing not only Islamic works, but Greek manuscripts that had been lost to the Christian world for centuries. Al-Hakam's scholars had possessed complete copies of Aristotle's works, including texts that Byzantine scholars knew only through fragments and Islamic commentaries. The secret preservation effort was motivated by more than intellectual curiosity. Spanish scholars had realized that Islamic texts contained advanced knowledge of navigation, engineering, and agriculture that would be essential for Spain's expansion into the New World. The astronomical works of al-Battani had corrected errors in the calculations European navigators were using to cross the Atlantic. The agricultural treatises of Ibn al-Awwam contained detailed instructions for cultivating crops in arid climates that would prove invaluable in the Americas. Perhaps most importantly, Islamic scholars had preserved and translated works of ancient philosophy and science that had been completely lost to Christian Europe. The complete writings of Galen on medicine, the mechanical engineering texts of Hero of Alexandria, the geographical works of Ptolemy, all had survived only through Arabic translations and commentaries. To burn these manuscripts would be to destroy humanity's only access to centuries of accumulated knowledge. The preservation network operated with extraordinary secrecy for nearly a century after the fall of Granada. Manuscripts were moved regularly between hiding places, their locations known only to a handful of trusted scholars and their descendants. A complex code system allowed these guardian families to communicate about the contents and condition of their hidden treasures without ever explicitly mentioning the manuscripts themselves. The most carefully guarded secret was the existence of original works by Islamic philosophers and scientists, texts that had never been translated into Latin and therefore remained completely unknown to European scholarship. These included the complete philosophical works of Ibn Tufayl, whose novel Hayy ibn Yaqzan had explored questions about human nature and knowledge that would not appear in European thought until the Enlightenment. They preserved the advanced mathematical treatises of Al-Kindi, who had developed algebraic concepts centuries before European mathematicians encountered them through other sources. The network's greatest treasure was a collection of astronomical observations and calculations that Islamic scholars had compiled over 8 centuries of systematic skywatching. These records contained precise measurements of planetary movements, calculations of the Earth's circumference that were accurate to within a few miles, and star charts that mapped celestial phenomena with unprecedented precision. European astronomy was centuries behind Islamic achievement, and these hidden manuscripts represented a treasure trove of scientific knowledge that could revolutionize European understanding of the cosmos. By the late 16th century, some of this knowledge began to leak into European intellectual circles through carefully orchestrated channels. Spanish scholars would discover fragments of ancient Greek texts in monastery libraries, failing to mention that these texts had survived only through Arabic translation and Islamic preservation. Mathematical concepts would appear in European treatises attributed to contemporary discoveries rather than to the Islamic scholars who had developed them centuries earlier. The hidden libraries of Islamic Spain represented perhaps the most successful intellectual preservation effort in European history. While the public burning of Arabic manuscripts satisfied political and religious requirements, the secret preservation of the most valuable texts ensured that Islamic scholarship would continue to influence European development long after the last Muslim had been expelled from Spanish soil. The knowledge survived, even as its origins were carefully obscured and its true authors forgotten. In the Salerno Medical School's archives, where women had practiced and taught medicine for 3 centuries before being systematically erased from the historical record, a final act of defiance was taking place. The year was 1426, and the last female professor, Margherita di Napoli, was dying slowly from a poison that had been administered during what she believed was a routine university dinner. As the toxin coursed through her body, she used her remaining strength to hide the most important medical texts written by women, burying them beneath stones that would not be disturbed for 500 years. The assassination was not random violence, but a calculated final step in a century-long campaign to eliminate women from the practice of medicine. Margherita possessed knowledge that challenged the fundamental assumptions of male-dominated medical theory. Knowledge based on direct observation of women's bodies and diseases that male physicians were forbidden to examine closely. Her hidden manuscripts contained revolutionary insights into human anatomy, surgical techniques, and pharmaceutical compounds that would not be rediscovered until the modern era. The most dangerous of Margherita's texts was her systematic refutation of the humoral theory that dominated medieval medicine. Through decades of careful observation and dissection, she had documented that many diseases attributed to imbalances of blood, phlegm, bile, and black bile were actually caused by specific infections, dietary deficiencies, and environmental factors. Her work anticipated germ theory by 4 centuries and included detailed drawings of microscopic organisms that she had observed through primitive magnifying devices. Equally threatening to male medical authority were Margherita's writings on surgery and anesthesia. She had developed techniques for cataract removal, kidney stone extraction, and caesarean sections that achieved survival rates far higher than those of her male colleagues. Most remarkably, she had created effective anesthetic compounds using combinations of opium, mandragora, and alcohol that could render patients unconscious for complex operations, knowledge that male surgeons desperately wanted to acquire while simultaneously denying that any woman could possess such expertise. The persecution of medical women had begun in earnest during the 13th century, as the Catholic Church and emerging university system combined to exclude women from formal medical education. Before this campaign, women had dominated many areas of medical practice, particularly in obstetrics, pediatrics, and pharmaceutical preparation. The famous Trotula of Salerno had written comprehensive texts on women's health that had been considered authoritative throughout Europe. Hildegard of Bingen had developed a sophisticated understanding of herbal medicine that combined empirical observation with mystical insight. But as medicine became professionalized and profitable, powerful interests moved to eliminate female competition. The Church declared that women's supposed intellectual inferiority made them unsuitable for medical practice, while emerging guilds established legal barriers that prevented women from obtaining the credentials necessary for formal practice. Most devastatingly, the rise of witch hunting provided a legal mechanism for eliminating skilled female healers whose knowledge threatened male monopolies. The witch trials that swept through Europe between the 14th and 17th centuries targeted midwives, herbalists, and female healers with particular intensity. These women possessed practical medical knowledge gained through generations of empirical practice, knowledge that often proved more effective than the theoretical medicine practiced by university-trained male physicians. Accusations of witchcraft provided a convenient way to eliminate this competition, while simultaneously discrediting the knowledge systems that female healers had developed. Margarita's hidden manuscripts documented this persecution in devastating detail. She had compiled testimonies from dozens of female healers who had been tortured into confessing to supernatural crimes, their real offense being their possession of medical knowledge that male physicians could not match. The records revealed that many women condemned as witches had been accomplished surgeons, skilled in procedures that male physicians considered impossible or too dangerous to attempt. The systematic elimination of women from medicine was accompanied by a deliberate effort to erase their contributions from medical history. Texts written by women were attributed to male authors or dismissed as inferior work, unworthy of preservation. The sophisticated pharmacological knowledge that female healers had developed through centuries of experimentation was appropriated by male physicians who presented it as their own discoveries. Medical techniques pioneered by women were credited to the male practitioners who had learned them by observing female healers at work. Among Margarita's most closely guarded secrets were the complete works of Metrodora, a female physician from the Byzantine Empire whose comprehensive medical text had been deliberately suppressed because it demonstrated a level of anatomical knowledge that challenged claims about women's intellectual limitations. Metrodora's work included detailed descriptions of surgical procedures, pharmaceutical preparations, and disease treatments that revealed the existence of a sophisticated tradition of female medical scholarship extending back to antiquity. The Iyyamas hidden manuscripts also preserved the medical innovations of Islamic women physicians who had practiced in Al-Andalus before the Christian conquest. These women had developed advanced techniques for treating eye diseases, performing dental surgery, and managing childbirth complications. Their knowledge had been systematically destroyed during the conquest of Islamic Spain, part of the broader effort to eliminate all traces of Islamic intellectual achievement from Christian Europe. As Margarita felt her strength failing, she carefully sealed her final manuscript, a comprehensive guide to detecting and treating various poisons that she had developed through bitter personal experience. This text contained detailed information about the symptoms, progression, and potential antidotes for dozens of toxic substances. knowledge that would prove invaluable to future physicians if it could somehow survive the centuries of suppression that were certain to follow her death. She pressed the sealed document into a hollow space within the wall, knowing that it would likely remain hidden until long after the medical profession had forgotten that women had ever possessed significant healing knowledge. The printing presses hummed through the night in Amsterdam's hidden cellars during the winter of 1703, their mechanical rhythms masked by the sound of rain against cobblestones and the distant tolling of church bells. Johannes van den Berg adjusted his spectacles as he supervised the production of books that would never bear a publisher's mark, never appear in any catalogue, never be sold in any legitimate bookshop. These were the forbidden texts of the early Enlightenment, works that challenged the divine right of kings, questioned the literal truth of Scripture, and proposed that human reason might be a better guide to truth than religious revelation. The underground printing network had evolved over decades of necessity, as European thinkers found their most important ideas banned by a alliance of church and state authorities who recognized the revolutionary potential of uncensored thought. What had begun as isolated efforts by individual scholars to share controversial ideas had grown into a sophisticated international system for producing and distributing forbidden knowledge throughout Europe. The network connected freethinkers from London to Vienna, creating a shadow intellectual community that operated parallel to official academic institutions. Van den Berg's cellar contained manuscripts that represented the cutting edge of European thought, works too dangerous for their authors to publish under their own names. The complete text of Spinoza's Ethics was being prepared in a new edition that would correct errors introduced by earlier underground printings. Locke's radical arguments about religious tolerance were being translated into German for distribution in the Holy Roman Empire, where such ideas could result in execution. Most controversially, the network was preparing to print Pierre Bayle's Systematic Refutation of Religious Miracles, a work that used historical analysis to demonstrate that supernatural claims could not withstand rational examination. The most carefully guarded manuscript in Van den Berg's possession was a work that its anonymous author had titled The Natural History of Religion. This text applied the same rational methods that scientists use to study the physical world to the study of religious belief itself, treating religion as a human institution that had evolved according to social and psychological needs rather than divine revelation. The implications were explosive. If religion was simply a human creation, then claims about divine authority for political power became meaningless. The underground network had developed elaborate security measures to protect both the texts and the people who produced them. Manuscripts were copied by hand by scribes who could read but not write, ensuring that they could not modify the texts they were reproducing. Type was cast in small batches using metal that could be quickly melted down if authorities approached. Finished books were bound in covers that disguised their true contents. Radical philosophical works appeared to be collections of sermons. Scientific treatises masqueraded as devotional literature. Distribution relied on a network of merchants, clergy, and scholars who moved freely across European borders and could transport books without arousing suspicion. A Flemish cloth merchant might carry philosophical texts sewn into the lining of his coat. A traveling priest could conceal banned works within legitimate theological volumes. University professors developed codes for communicating about forbidden texts, discussing Italian poetry when they meant political theory and botanical specimens when they referred to atheistic philosophy. The network's greatest achievement was preserving and disseminating the complete works of scholars whose ideas had been condemned by religious authorities. The writings of Giordano Bruno, burned at the stake in 1600 for proposing that the universe contained infinite worlds, survived only through underground copying and printing. His cosmological theories, which anticipated modern understanding of stellar systems and planetary formation, influenced generations of scientists who could never acknowledge their debt to a condemned heretic. Similarly, the mathematical and scientific works of Islamic scholars continued to circulate through underground channels long after they had been officially banned in Christian Europe. The algebraic innovations of al-Khwarizmi, the astronomical observations of al-Battani, and the optical theories of Ibn al-Haytham reached European intellectuals through carefully disguised translations that attributed the discoveries to anonymous, ancient Greek sources or recently discovered Latin manuscripts. The underground network also preserved the political writings of authors whose ideas about democracy, religious freedom, and individual rights threatened established authority. Works that proposed elected governments, criticized hereditary monarchy, or argued for separation of church and state were systematically banned by authorities who recognized their revolutionary potential. The network ensured that these ideas survived and spread, creating an intellectual foundation for the political revolutions that would transform Europe in the 18th and 19th centuries. Perhaps most remarkably, the network facilitated communication between scholars across religious and national boundaries that were supposedly impermeable. Jewish philosophers in Amsterdam could share ideas with Catholic scientists in Paris and Protestant theologians in Edinburgh, creating a community of rational inquiry that transcended the sectarian divisions that dominated official intellectual life. This underground republic of letters demonstrated that human beings could cooperate in the pursuit of truth regardless of their religious or political affiliations. The financial support for these operations came from wealthy merchants and aristocrats who had been convinced by Enlightenment arguments about the value of free inquiry. These patrons understood that supporting underground printing was extraordinarily dangerous. Discovery could result in imprisonment, financial ruin, or worse. But they also recognized that the preservation and dissemination of rational thought was essential for human progress, and they were willing to risk their fortunes to ensure that important ideas survived periods of official repression. As dawn approached, Van der Berg carefully packed the night's production into specially constructed containers that would protect the books during transport. Some would travel north to Scandinavia, where relatively tolerant governments allowed more intellectual freedom. Others would head east into Poland and Russia, where underground networks of nobles and clergy were eager for access to Western philosophical developments. A few precious copies would make the dangerous journey south into France and Spain, where the Inquisition maintained constant vigilance against forbidden ideas, but where demand for underground literature remained strong. The rain had stopped by. The time Van der Berg extinguished his lamps and secured his cellar for the day. He knew that somewhere across Europe, other members of the network were beginning their own nocturnal work, ensuring that the light of reason would continue to burn, even in the darkest corners of an age that too often preferred the comfortable darkness of unquestioned authority. The books would find their readers, the ideas would spread, and eventually the underground would become the mainstream, though that transformation would require decades of patient, dangerous work by individuals whose names would never appear in any history of the Enlightenment. Forbidden knowledge, like morning mist that clung to the valleys where ancient peoples once walked. These were the stories that empires decided must never reach the light, the truths that challenged the very foundations upon which modern understanding rested. In the heart of what would become the American Midwest, where the Mississippi River carved its ancient path through fertile plains, there once stood a city that rivaled London in size and sophistication. This was Cahokia, a metropolis of 30,000 souls that flourished between 900 and 1200 CE, yet its existence was systematically erased from the historical narrative that would define the New World. The great mounds rose like sleeping giants from the earth, their terraced sides catching the first light of dawn as they had for centuries. At the center stood Monk's Mound, a colossal pyramid that stretched higher than many European cathedrals. Its summit crowned with temples where the rulers of this forgotten civilization once communed with the stars. The burial of Cahokia's history began not with time, but with intention. When European colonizers encountered the massive earthworks scattered across the Mississippi Valley, they faced a profound challenge to their carefully constructed narrative of Native American societies as simple, nomadic peoples living in harmony with nature but lacking the capacity for true civilization. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Here were the remains of a complex urban society with sophisticated astronomy, intricate trade networks that stretched from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, and monumental architecture that required generations of coordinated effort. The city's central plaza alone could hold 20,000 people, suggesting public ceremonies and gatherings on a scale that spoke to advanced social organization. Yet the response was systematic erasure. Early European chroniclers attributed the mounds to a lost race of mound builders, anyone but the indigenous peoples they were displacing. This fiction allowed colonizers to maintain the narrative that they were bringing civilization to an empty wilderness rather than conquering and destroying existing advanced societies. Archaeological evidence revealed a city of remarkable sophistication. The inhabitants of Cahokia had developed a calendar more accurate than those used in medieval Europe, tracking celestial movements with precision that allowed them to predict eclipses and seasonal changes. Their agricultural techniques, including the Three Sisters method of companion planting corn, beans, and squash, were so advanced that they would later be adopted by European settlers as essential for survival. The city's layout revealed urban planning principles that wouldn't be rediscovered in European cities for centuries. Streets were laid out in cardinal directions. Neighborhoods were organized by craft specialization, and the entire complex was designed around astronomical alignments that connected earthly governance with cosmic order. Trade networks centered at Cahokia brought copper from the Great Lakes, shells from the Atlantic and Gulf coasts, and exotic materials from as far away as the Rocky Mountains. The city served as a hub of commerce and cultural exchange that connected disparate peoples across vast distances, facilitating the spread of innovations, artistic styles, and religious practices. In the workshops of Cahokia, artisans crafted objects of stunning beauty and spiritual significance. Shell beads were carved with such precision that they seemed to glow with inner light. Copper was shaped into ceremonial plaques depicting falcon warriors, their eyes inlaid with pearls that captured the essence of divine power. These were not the simple handicrafts of a primitive people, but the sophisticated creations of master craftsmen working within a complex artistic tradition. The deliberate suppression of Cahokia's history extended into the modern era. Even as archaeological evidence mounted through the 19th and 20th centuries, educational curricula continued to present a sanitized version of pre-Columbian America that emphasized small tribal societies over complex urban civilizations. The key, massive scale of Cahokia's achievements was relegated to academic circles, kept from public consciousness that might question the fundamental narratives of American expansion and manifest destiny. The city's decline around 1200 CE remains a subject of scholarly debate, but evidence suggests it was neither sudden collapse nor conquest. Instead, Cahokia appears to have been gradually abandoned as climate changes affected agricultural productivity and political power shifted to other centers. The people didn't disappear. They dispersed into the various tribal societies that Europeans would later encounter, carrying with them the knowledge and traditions of their sophisticated urban past. This dispersal itself became part of the buried history. By the time European colonizers arrived, the political landscape had transformed, and the descendants of Cahokia's inhabitants had reorganized into different social structures. The colonizers encountered these peoples in their current form and assumed this was how they had always lived, never imagining the complex urban civilization that had preceded their arrival. While medieval Europe struggled through what historians would later call the Dark Ages, the Iberian Peninsula blazed with intellectual light under Islamic rule. Al-Andalus, as Muslim Spain was known, became a beacon of learning, tolerance, and scientific advancement that would profoundly influence the Renaissance centuries later. Yet this golden age of Islamic scholarship and cultural synthesis was systematically minimized in later historical accounts, buried beneath narratives of Christian reconquest and European exceptionalism. The Library of Córdoba alone housed over 400,000 volumes at a time when the largest libraries in Christian Europe contained perhaps a few hundred books. This vast collection represented knowledge gathered from across the known world. Greek philosophy, Indian mathematics, Persian poetry, and original works by Islamic scholars who were pushing the boundaries of human understanding in every field, from medicine to astronomy. In the streets of Córdoba, three faiths walked side by side in a harmony that would be nearly unimaginable in the fractured Europe of the same era. Jews, Christians, and Muslims engaged in scholarly debates that lasted late into the night, their discussions illuminated by oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on walls lined with books in Arabic, Hebrew, and Latin. Knowledge flowed freely across religious boundaries, creating a synthesis of ideas that would form the foundation of European learning centuries later. The scholars of Al-Andalus made groundbreaking contributions that were systematically downplayed in later European accounts. Ibn Rushd, known in the West as Averroes, developed philosophical works that would profoundly influence Thomas Aquinas and other Christian thinkers, yet his Islamic identity was often obscured in later European scholarship. Similarly, Ibn Sina's medical texts remained standard textbooks in European universities for over 5 centuries, but his contributions were gradually attributed to European authorities or stripped of their Islamic context. The systematic burial of Al-Andalus's intellectual achievements began during the Reconquista, as Christian kingdoms gradually reconquered the peninsula between the 11th and 15th centuries. Libraries were burned, manuscripts were destroyed, and entire traditions of learning were eliminated. The conquest of Córdoba in 1236 resulted in the destruction of irreplaceable texts, while the fall of Granada in 1492 marked the end of nearly 8 centuries of Islamic rule and the beginning of systematic cultural erasure. What made this erasure particularly tragic was the unique nature of Andalusian intellectual culture. Unlike the more rigid scholastic traditions that dominated medieval Europe, Islamic Spain fostered an environment of open inquiry where scholars from different traditions could challenge, debate, and build upon each other's ideas. This cross-cultural fertilization produced innovations in mathematics, medicine, philosophy, and the arts that wouldn't be matched elsewhere for centuries. The House of Wisdom in Córdoba served as a translation center where scholars rendered Greek, Persian, and Sanskrit texts into Arabic, preserving and expanding upon classical knowledge that had been lost elsewhere. These translations often included commentary and original insights that advanced understanding far beyond the original texts. When these works were later translated into Latin, however, the Islamic contributions were frequently omitted or attributed to Christian scholars. In medicine, Andalusian physicians developed surgical techniques and medical theories that were centuries ahead of their European contemporaries. They performed complex eye surgeries, understood the circulation of blood through the pulmonary system, and established hospitals with standards of cleanliness and patient care that wouldn't be adopted in Europe until much later. Yet these innovations were gradually incorporated into European medical practice without acknowledgement of their Islamic origins. The gardens of Al-Andalus represented another form of buried knowledge, the sophisticated understanding of botany, hydraulics, and landscape, design that transformed the arid plains of southern Spain into paradises of flowing water and exotic plants. These gardens were living laboratories where scholars studied plant cultivation, developed new irrigation techniques, and created spaces of beauty that inspired poetry and philosophical contemplation. The mathematical innovations of Andalusian scholars were perhaps most thoroughly buried. While European merchants still struggled with Roman numerals, Islamic mathematicians in Spain were developing algebraic concepts and geometric principles that would become fundamental to the scientific revolution. Their work on trigonometry, decimal fractions, and abstract mathematical reasoning laid groundwork that European scholars would later claim as their own discoveries. The poetry and literature of Al-Andalus created new forms of artistic expression that influenced European literature in ways that are still being recognized by modern scholars. The courtly love tradition that became central to medieval European literature drew heavily from Arabic poetic forms developed in Andalusian courts. The narrative techniques and philosophical themes of Islamic Spanish literature would resurface in the works of Dante, Chaucer, and other foundational European authors, though the connections were rarely acknowledged. The philosophical debates that flourished in Al-Andalus addressed fundamental questions about reason, faith, and the nature of knowledge in ways that anticipated and influenced the European Enlightenment. These discussions took place in an atmosphere of intellectual freedom that encouraged questioning and exploration of ideas that would be considered heretical in other medieval contexts. The systematic burial of this tradition represented not just the loss of specific knowledge, but the erasure of an entire approach to learning that valued inquiry over orthodoxy. Long before the establishment of medical schools that would exclude women for centuries, the ancient world knew healers whose knowledge of anatomy, pharmacology, and surgical techniques rivaled or exceeded that of their male contemporaries. These women practitioners, from the priestess physicians of ancient Egypt to the learned midwives of medieval Europe, formed a continuous tradition of medical knowledge that was systematically erased as medicine became professionalized and masculinized. Merit Ptah, who lived in ancient Egypt around 2700 BCE, holds the distinction of being the first named woman physician in recorded history. Her son, who served as a high priest, described her on his tomb as the chief physician, indicating that she held a position of significant authority in the medical hierarchy of her time. Yet her achievements vanished from medical histories that focused on male practitioners. her knowledge buried beneath layers of institutional forgetting. In the temples of ancient Egypt, where medicine and spirituality intertwined like the threads of a sacred tapestry, women physicians moved through halls lined with papyrus scrolls containing medical knowledge that spanned generations. Their hands, trained in the subtle arts of diagnosis and healing, could read the stories written in human bodies, the pulse that spoke of heart troubles, the pallor that revealed blood loss, the particular quality of breathing that indicated lung disease. The systematic exclusion of women from medical practice began gradually, then accelerated as healing transformed from a spiritual calling to a secular profession. Church authorities in medieval Europe increasingly viewed healing by women as potentially heretical, especially when it involved knowledge of herbs and remedies that had been passed down through generations of traditional practice. The witch trials that swept across Europe represented in part a systematic campaign to eliminate women's medical knowledge and replace it with male-dominated institutional medicine. Trotula of Salerno, who practiced medicine in the 11th century, wrote influential texts on gynecology and general medicine that were used as standard references for centuries. Her work demonstrated sophisticated understanding of anatomy and treatment techniques that wouldn't be matched by institutional medicine for generations. Yet as medicine became more formally organized, Trotula's contributions were gradually attributed to male colleagues or dismissed as the work of midwives rather than true physicians. The medical knowledge possessed by women practitioners often surpassed that available in formal medical training. While university-trained physicians relied primarily on theoretical knowledge derived from ancient texts, women healers developed practical understanding through direct experience treating patients. Their knowledge of herbal medicine, nutrition, anatomy, and surgical techniques was accumulated through generations of practice and observation. In the Islamic world, where women could practice medicine more freely than in medieval Europe, female physicians made significant contributions that were later buried by historical accounts that focused on male scholars. Rufaida al-Aslamiyya, who lived during the time of Prophet Muhammad, established what may have been the first nursing school and hospital staffed primarily by women. Her innovations in wound care, surgical assistance, and patient rehabilitation influenced Islamic medical practice for centuries. The burial of women's medical knowledge represented more than just gender discrimination. It involved the systematic elimination of healing traditions that emphasized holistic care, prevention, and the integration of physical and emotional health. Women practitioners typically viewed illness within the context of a patient's entire life circumstances, considering factors like nutrition, living conditions, emotional stress, and social relationships in their diagnoses and treatments. In the secret chambers where knowledge was preserved against the tide of forgetting, women continued to practice and teach their healing arts. Mothers passed remedies to daughters through whispered instructions and careful demonstration. Herbs were gathered at precise moments when their medicinal properties peaked, and formulas were memorized with the precision of poetry, each ingredient and proportion carrying centuries of accumulated wisdom. The anatomical knowledge possessed by women practitioners was often superior to that taught in medical schools. Midwives in particular developed sophisticated understanding of reproductive anatomy and physiology through direct experience that male physicians, who were typically forbidden from attending births, could not match. Their knowledge of childbirth complications, infant care, and women's health issues was based on practical experience rather than theoretical speculation. Surgery was another area where women practitioners excelled before being systematically excluded. Historical records describe women performing cataract surgery, setting bones, and treating battlefield wounds with skill that impressed contemporary observers. These surgical techniques were often more advanced than those taught in formal medical schools, incorporating innovations developed through practical necessity and refined through experience. The pharmaceutical knowledge of women healers encompassed not only which plants and minerals possessed healing properties, but also how to prepare, combine, and administer them most effectively. This knowledge included understanding of drug interactions, dosage calculations, and the preparation of complex compounds that required precise timing and technique. Much of this pharmacological wisdom was lost when traditional healing practices were suppressed and replaced by less sophisticated alternatives. The psychological aspects of healing were particularly emphasized in women's medical practice. Female healers understood the connection between emotional states and physical health in ways that wouldn't be formally recognized by institutional medicine until the modern era. Their treatment approaches often included counseling, emotional support, and attention to the social circumstances that contributed to illness. The systematic burial of women's medical knowledge accelerated during the Renaissance, as medicine became increasingly professionalized and institutionalized. Universities that trained physicians explicitly excluded women, while legislation was passed restricting medical practice to those with formal education. This created a cycle where women were denied access to official medical training, then dismissed as unqualified to practice medicine. Beneath the Southern Cross, where ancient peoples tracked the movements of celestial bodies with precision that would astound modern astronomers, lay knowledge systems that rivaled and often surpassed the astronomical understanding of their contemporary civilizations across the globe. These indigenous astronomical traditions, developed over millennia of careful observation and mathematical refinement, were systematically dismissed and buried beneath colonial narratives that portrayed native peoples as primitive and unscientific. The astronomical knowledge of the Aboriginal Australians represents one of humanity's oldest continuous scientific traditions, stretching back over 60,000 years of careful sky observation and mathematical calculation. Their understanding of stellar positions, planetary movements, and celestial cycles was encoded in songlines and story cycles that served as both navigational aids and sophisticated astronomical databases. In the vast silence of the Australian outback, where the Milky Way stretches across the sky like a river of stars, elders sat with young initiates around fires that had burned in the same spots for countless generations. Their voices rose and fell in ancient rhythms, singing the movements of stars and planets with precision that encoded complex astronomical data in forms that could be memorized and passed down without loss of accuracy. The burial of indigenous astronomical knowledge began with the assumption that oral traditions could not contain genuine scientific information. European colonizers, encountering sophisticated astronomical knowledge embedded in indigenous languages and cultural practices, dismissed these traditions as mythology rather than recognizing them as alternative forms of scientific recording and transmission. Recent investigations have revealed that Aboriginal star maps possessed accuracy levels that exceeded European astronomical charts of the same period. These indigenous astronomers had identified and tracked double star systems, variable stars, and celestial phenomena that European science wouldn't recognize for centuries. Their mathematical understanding of stellar positions and movements was encoded in ceremonial ground paintings, dance movements, and story cycles that served as three-dimensional star charts. The Inca civilization developed astronomical observations that were among the most accurate in the ancient world, tracking celestial movements with precision that enabled them to create calendars more accurate than those used in medieval Europe. Their understanding of solar and lunar cycles was so sophisticated that they could predict eclipses centuries in advance. Yet this knowledge was systematically destroyed during Spanish colonization, its records burned, and its practitioners persecuted as practitioners of pagan astronomy. Machu Picchu and other Inca sites were designed as massive astronomical instruments, their architecture aligned with celestial events and their stone structures serving as observatories for tracking the movements of stars, planets, and other celestial bodies. The precision of these alignments demonstrates mathematical and engineering capabilities that challenge conventional assumptions about pre-Columbian technological achievements. The Maya civilization developed astronomical knowledge that was arguably the most advanced in the pre-Columbian world, creating calendars and astronomical tables of stunning accuracy. Their calculations of planetary cycles, particularly for Venus and Mars, were more precise than European astronomical data available at the time of contact. They predicted eclipses, tracked comets, and maintained astronomical records spanning thousands of years. In the shadow of pyramids that served as massive astronomical instruments, Maya priest astronomers worked through nights illuminated by torchlight, their calculations scratched into bark paper and carved into stone monuments that would preserve their observations for future generations. They watched the sky with intensity born of necessity, knowing that agricultural cycles, ceremonial timing, and political decisions all depended on their accurate understanding of celestial movements. The systematic destruction of Maya astronomical records during Spanish colonization represented one of history's greatest losses of scientific knowledge. Bishop Diego de Landa ordered the burning of Maya books in 1562, destroying centuries of accumulated astronomical data and mathematical innovations. Only 4 Maya codices survived this cultural genocide, representing a tiny fraction of what was once a vast library of scientific knowledge. Indigenous astronomers across the Americas developed sophisticated understanding of celestial mechanics that informed not only calendar systems, but also architectural design, agricultural practices, and navigation techniques. The ancestral Puebloans built structures aligned with solstices and equinoxes, while Pacific Island navigators used star positions and wave patterns to traverse vast ocean distances with accuracy that astounded European explorers. The mathematical foundations underlying indigenous astronomical systems often surpassed contemporary European capabilities. Maya mathematicians developed the concept of zero independently of Old World civilizations and created numerical systems that could handle astronomical calculations of extraordinary complexity. Their understanding of cyclical time and mathematical relationships between celestial periods demonstrated abstract mathematical thinking that wouldn't appear in European scholarship for centuries. The burial of indigenous astronomical knowledge continued into the modern era, as Western science established itself as the sole legitimate form of scientific inquiry. Even as archaeastronomy began to reveal the sophistication of indigenous astronomical traditions, this knowledge was often presented as curiosities rather than genuine scientific achievements that could contribute to contemporary understanding. Traditional ecological knowledge, closely linked to astronomical observation, represented another form of buried scientific wisdom. Indigenous peoples developed understanding of seasonal cycles, weather patterns, and ecological relationships based on long-term observation of both terrestrial and celestial phenomena. This knowledge enabled sustainable resource management practices that maintained ecological balance for thousands of years. The navigation techniques developed by Pacific Island peoples demonstrated integration of astronomical knowledge with understanding of ocean currents, wave patterns, and weather systems that enabled them to traverse vast distances across open ocean. These navigation methods required mental processing of multiple variables and mathematical calculations that rivaled the complexity of European maritime navigation techniques. The systematic dismissal of indigenous astronomical knowledge as folklore or mythology prevented recognition of its scientific value and contributed to the loss of invaluable data about long-term celestial phenomena. Indigenous observations often spanned centuries or millennia, providing records of astronomical events and cycles that could have contributed significantly to modern astronomical understanding if they had been preserved and studied rather than dismissed and destroyed. The threads of buried knowledge stretched across continents and centuries, weaving patterns of concealment that revealed as much about the concealers as about the concealed. Each story of systematic erasure exposed the political, cultural, and economic motivations that drove the burial of inconvenient truths, the suppression of alternative ways of knowing, and the elimination of voices that challenged dominant narratives. In the spaces between what was remembered and what was forgotten, between what was celebrated and what was silenced, lay the true complexity of human, the mountain fortress, where monks had spent centuries transcribing texts that emperors wanted, erased, their brushstrokes becoming acts of quiet rebellion against the tyranny of forgetting. These scribes worked by candlelight, their fingers cramped from cold and devotion, knowing that each character they preserved might be the last thread connecting future generations to truths that powerful men sought to bury beneath layers of propaganda and convenient lies. In the court records of medieval Byzantium, there exists a curious gap. 7 months during which no imperial decrees were issued, no audiences granted, no ceremonies recorded. Official historians would later explain this silence as a period of imperial illness, but buried in the private correspondence of court physicians and the coded letters of palace servants lies a different story entirely. During those 7 months, the Byzantine Empire was ruled not by Constantine VII, but by his daughter Theodora, a woman whose intelligence and political acumen had been carefully hidden behind the veil of traditional femininity that the court demanded of imperial women. Theodora had been educated in secret by her mother, who had recognized in her daughter a mind that could grasp the complex web of Byzantine politics better than any of her brothers. While they learned swordplay and rhetoric, she studied the subtle art of governance through careful observation and whispered conversations with trusted advisors who saw in her the qualities that her father increasingly lacked. When Constantine fell into the mysterious illness that would claim his life, possibly poisoning, though this too was buried, Theodora stepped into the void with a seamless grace that spoke of long preparation. She ruled through intermediaries, her decisions flowing through carefully chosen courtiers who presented her policies as emanating from the sick room where her father supposedly lay recuperating. Trade agreements were negotiated, territorial disputes resolved, and rebellious provinces brought to heel through a combination of diplomatic finesse and strategic concessions that demonstrated a deep understanding of the empire's complex ethnic and religious tensions. Under her hidden guidance, the Byzantine treasury swelled, the military was reorganized, and a series of educational reforms were implemented that would benefit the empire for generations to come. But when Constantine finally died, the council of nobles moved swiftly to install Theodora's younger brother as emperor, dismissing the 7 months of effective governance as a fortunate period of administrative continuity maintained by loyal bureaucrats. Theodora herself was quietly married to a minor provincial governor and sent far from Constantinople, her name carefully excised from official records except for brief mentions as a dutiful daughter who had nursed her ailing father. The burial of Theodora's reign was so complete that even modern historians struggle to piece together the evidence of her rule. Documents were altered, dates changed, and the testimonies of those who had served under her were either destroyed or rewritten to credit her achievements to others. Yet, in the margins of administrative texts, in the private letters of foreign ambassadors, and in the folk songs of Byzantine provinces, traces of her governance survived. A Venetian merchant wrote of negotiating a favorable trade agreement with the wisest mind at court, noting that this negotiator possessed an uncanny understanding of both commercial law and regional politics that seemed far beyond the capabilities of the minor officials who officially conducted the talks. Across the American frontier in the decades following the Civil War, a remarkable network of schools emerged in the rural communities where freed slaves had settled. These institutions, funded by a combination of northern philanthropic societies and the hard-earned savings of former slaves themselves, represented one of the most ambitious educational movements in American history. Yet their story was systematically buried, not only by those who opposed African American education, but also by later historians who found their existence inconvenient to narratives about post-war reconstruction. The schools were established with the understanding that education was not merely about literacy, but about the fundamental reshaping of a society that had been built on the premise that one race was inherently inferior to another. The curriculum included not only reading, writing, and arithmetic, but also constitutional law, public speaking, agricultural science, and what we would now call civic engagement. Students learned about their rights as citizens, studied the structure of government, and debated the great questions of democracy and equality that the war had supposedly settled, but which continued to rage in the political arena. What made these schools particularly dangerous to the established order was their commitment to teaching both black and white children together. In communities where such integration was possible, usually remote areas where federal oversight was minimal and local sentiment more progressive, the schools became laboratories for racial cooperation that directly challenged the segregationist policies being implemented elsewhere in the South. Children who learned together, played together, and developed friendships across racial lines grew into adults with very different attitudes about race and equality than those who were educated in the segregated systems that would dominate the region for the next century. The effectiveness of these schools can be measured not only in literacy rates, which among their graduates approached those of northern whites, but in the remarkable number of their alumni who went on to become teachers, lawyers, doctors, and political leaders. Within a generation, communities that had established these integrated schools saw the emergence of an educated black middle class that posed a direct challenge to the economic and political structures that had replaced slavery. It was precisely this success that led to their systematic destruction. By the 1890s, a combination of legal challenges, economic pressure, and outright violence had forced most of these schools to close or segregate. The buildings were often burned, the teachers threatened or driven away, and the records of their achievements carefully suppressed. Local newspapers that had once proudly reported on graduation ceremonies and academic achievements suddenly stopped mentioning the schools altogether. State education departments redirected funding away from communities that had attempted integration, and federal support was quietly withdrawn as political priorities shifted away from reconstruction and toward reconciliation with the White South. Burial of this educational experiment was so thorough that by the early 20th century, many Americans believed that meaningful integration had never been attempted in the post-war period. The narrative of inevitable segregation, of natural racial animosity that made peaceful coexistence impossible, was easier to accept than the truth that successful integration had been achieved and then deliberately destroyed by those who found its implications too threatening to tolerate. In the archives of the British Foreign Office, filed under a classification that kept it secret for nearly a century, lies the correspondence of Sir Reginald Whitmore, a career diplomat whose work in the years leading up to World War I may have delayed the conflict by several years and saved hundreds of thousands of lives. Whitmore's story was buried not because his efforts failed, but because their success contradicted the official narrative about the inevitability of the Great War and the noble intentions of the governments that fought it. Whitmore had been posted to various European capitals throughout the first decade of the 20th century, ostensibly as a cultural attaché responsible for organizing exhibitions and educational exchanges. In reality, he was conducting an unauthorized diplomatic mission, using his contacts among artists, intellectuals, and minor nobility to create back-channel communications between the rival alliance systems that were slowly but inevitably moving Europe toward war. His method was elegant in its simplicity. Rather than engaging in the formal diplomatic processes that had become increasingly rigid and ritualistic as tensions mounted, Whitmore organized what he called cultural conversations, informal gatherings where intellectuals and artists from different countries could meet in neutral settings to discuss not politics, but philosophy, literature, and art. These gatherings, held in private homes and artist studios across Europe, created personal relationships that transcended national boundaries and provided opportunities for unofficial diplomatic communication. Through these networks, Whitmore was able to identify and address specific points of tension before they could escalate into international incidents. When a minor border dispute between Austria-Hungary and Serbia threatened to trigger the alliance systems in 1911, Whitmore's contacts enabled him to craft a face-saving compromise that allowed both sides to step back from confrontation. When German and French military leaders were interpreting routine exercises as preparations for invasion, Whitmore arranged for informal communications that clarified intentions and reduced the risk of preemptive action. Perhaps most remarkably, Whitmore's network succeeded in preventing what might have been an earlier and even more devastating war. In 1912, a series of miscommunications and misinterpreted diplomatic signals had brought Europe closer to general war than most people realized. Through his cultural contacts, Whitmore was able to arrange a series of secret meetings between key decision-makers from the rival camps, not in their official capacities, but as private individuals interested in preventing catastrophe. These meetings, conducted in artist studios and private libraries across neutral Switzerland, allowed the participants to speak candidly about their fears and intentions without the posturing and face-saving that characterized official diplomacy. German generals were able to explain that their military preparations were defensive responses to what they perceived as French aggression. French politicians could clarify that their alliance with Russia was not intended as a preparation for offensive war, but as a deterrent against German expansion. Austrian diplomats could acknowledge that their Balkan policies were driven more by internal political pressures than by imperial ambition. The success of these informal negotiations bought Europe 2 more years of peace, years that allowed for economic development, cultural exchange, and the gradual development of international institutions that might have provided alternatives to war. But Whitmore's efforts were viewed with suspicion by his own government, which worried that unauthorized diplomacy undermined official policy and created dangerous precedents for diplomatic independence. When war finally came in 1914, Whitmore's attempts to use his network to prevent the crisis from escalating were actively discouraged by the Foreign Office, which had concluded that war might be preferable to continued uncertainty. His correspondence from this period, filled with increasingly desperate attempts to arrange the kind of informal meetings that had succeeded before, reveals a man watching helplessly as the world descended into a conflict he knew could still be prevented. After the war, Whitmore's files were classified and his methods officially discouraged as naive idealism that had potentially prolonged a crisis that was better resolved through decisive action. The narrative that the war had been inevitable, that no amount of diplomacy could have prevented it, was more palatable than acknowledging that alternative approaches had been available but deliberately abandoned in favor of military solutions. The decades following the Russian Revolution, as Soviet authorities tightened their control over intellectual life and artistic expression, a remarkable underground network emerged to preserve and transmit the cultural treasures that the new regime sought to bury or destroy. This network, which operated with the same secrecy and courage as the American Underground Railroad, ensured that books, paintings, musical compositions, and philosophical works that had been banned or condemned continued to circulate among those brave enough to risk persecution for the crime of reading or thinking freely. The network began organically as individual teachers, librarians, and intellectuals recognized that the cultural heritage of Russia was being systematically erased in favor of ideologically approved works that served the political needs of the moment, rather than allowing millennia of human achievement to disappear into the fires of revolutionary zeal. These quiet heroes began the dangerous work of preservation and transmission. Books were copied by hand in apartments and basements, the work divided among dozens of volunteers, so that no single person possessed complete texts that could be used as evidence of subversive activity. Paintings were photographed using primitive equipment, the images carefully developed in improvised darkrooms, and then passed from hand to hand like samizdat literature. Musical compositions were memorized and taught orally, maintained in the minds of musicians who performed them in private gatherings that carried the risk of exile, or worse if discovered. The network developed elaborate codes and procedures to minimize the risk of detection. Books were often disguised as approved texts, with new covers and title pages that made banned works appear to be volumes of Marx or Lenin. Philosophical discussions were conducted in the language of agricultural or industrial planning, with Plato's Republic discussed as a treatise on collective farming, and Dostoevsky's insights into human nature presented as studies in worker psychology. Perhaps most remarkably, the network succeeded in maintaining connections with similar movements in other Soviet territories and even in the West. Through a chain of contacts that stretched from Moscow to Prague to Paris, banned works were not only preserved, but continued to evolve and develop. Russian poets whose works were forbidden in their homeland continued to write and publish abroad, their new poems making their way back through the underground network to inspire and sustain those who remained behind. The personal cost of participation in this network was enormous. Teachers lost their positions, librarians were sent to labor camps, and entire families were exiled to Siberia for the crime of possessing banned books. Yet the network not only survived but grew, as each generation of participants recognized that they were the guardians of something more precious than their own safety, the accumulated wisdom and beauty of human civilization itself. When the Soviet system finally collapsed in the early 1990s, investigators were amazed to discover the extent and sophistication of this underground preservation effort. Complete libraries of banned books emerged from hiding places that had protected them for decades. Paintings that had been thought lost forever were found carefully preserved in basements and attics. Musical compositions that existed nowhere in official archives were performed again by musicians who had kept them alive through decades of secret practice. Yet the story of this network remains largely buried, in part because acknowledging its existence would require confronting uncomfortable truths about the complicity of Western intellectuals who minimized or ignored Soviet cultural repression, and in part because the heroism of ordinary people who risked everything to preserve books and paintings does not fit neatly into grand narratives about political movements and ideological struggles. In the medical journals of ancient Egypt, buried beneath layers of mystical language and religious ceremony, lie the records of surgical procedures and pharmaceutical knowledge that would not be rediscovered by Western medicine for over 2,000 years. These texts, deliberately obscured by the priestly class that controlled medical practice, contain detailed descriptions of brain surgery, sophisticated understanding of circulation and anatomy, and pharmacological knowledge that rivaled anything available in the ancient world. The burial of this knowledge was not accidental, but reflected the political and economic interests of those who controlled access to healing. In ancient Egypt, as in many early civilizations, medicine was closely connected to religious authority, and the priests, who served as physicians, had strong incentives to maintain their monopoly on medical knowledge by ensuring that their most effective techniques remained secret. Archaeological evidence suggests that Egyptian physicians were performing successful cataract surgery more than 4,000 years ago, using bronze instruments of remarkable sophistication and anesthetic, preparations that rendered patients unconscious during the procedure. They understood the relationship between the heart and blood circulation, centuries before Harvey's supposed discovery of this principle in the 17th century. They had developed antibiotics derived from bread mold and other natural sources, and their understanding of anatomy was detailed enough to allow for complex internal surgeries that would not be attempted again until the Renaissance. But this knowledge was recorded in deliberately cryptic language that required years of training. To decipher, and access to the medical texts was strictly controlled by the priestly hierarchy. When young physicians were trained, they learned only the procedures they would need for their specific roles, while the theoretical understanding that unified these practices remained the exclusive province of the high priests who led the medical establishment. The burial of Egyptian medical knowledge became complete when the Roman conquest disrupted the priestly education system and scattered the medical libraries. Some texts were preserved in the Library of Alexandria, but even there they were filed in ways that made them difficult for foreign scholars to access and understand. When the library was finally destroyed, not through any single dramatic fire, but through centuries of neglect and political upheaval, the medical knowledge it contained vanished along with works of literature and philosophy that have received far more attention from historians. Similar patterns of deliberate burial can be found in other medical traditions. In medieval Europe, the healing knowledge of women practitioners, midwives, herbalists, and folk healers was systematically suppressed as the emerging medical establishment sought to professionalize and control access to healing. These women, often possessed sophisticated understanding of pharmacology, surgery, and disease treatment that rivaled or exceeded the knowledge taught in the newly established medical schools, but their practices were dismissed as superstition or, worse, condemned as witchcraft. The knowledge these women possessed was not written down in formal medical texts, but transmitted orally from mother to daughter, teacher to student, in an unbroken chain that stretched back centuries. They understood the use of plants and minerals for healing, the management of childbirth and women's health issues, and the treatment of mental illness through what we would now recognize as early forms of psychotherapy. Their diagnostic techniques, based on careful observation and accumulated experience, were often more accurate than the theoretical approaches taught in medical schools. The persecution of these practitioners during the witch trials of the 16th and 17th centuries was not merely a result of religious hysteria, but reflected economic and professional competition. Male physicians, trained in university programs that emphasized theoretical knowledge over practical experience, found their authority challenged by women whose empirical approach to healing often produced better results. The solution was to criminalize women's medical practice by associating it with diabolic influence, effectively transferring their patients and their knowledge to the emerging medical establishment. The burial of women's medical knowledge was so complete that modern medical history typically presents the development of scientific medicine as a linear progression from superstition to rationality, with little acknowledgement of the sophisticated healing traditions that were deliberately destroyed in the process. Only in recent decades have medical historians begun to reconstruct the scope and effectiveness of these buried practices, often finding that techniques dismissed as primitive or dangerous were actually based on sound empirical observation and produced outcomes comparable to or better than contemporary medical interventions. Across the world, in boarding schools and government offices, in mission stations and colonial administrative centers, a systematic campaign was waged against the languages that indigenous peoples had used to encode their understanding of the world. This was not merely cultural imperialism, but a deliberate strategy to break the chains of memory that connected communities to their ancestral knowledge, their land rights, and their alternative ways of organizing society. In North America, the boarding school system established in the late 19th century was explicitly designed to kill the Indian and save the man, as the phrase of the time put it. Children were forcibly removed from their families and communities, forbidden to speak their native languages, and punished severely for any attempt to maintain cultural practices that connected them to their heritage. But the languages they were forced to abandon contained far more than mere vocabulary. They encoded complex systems of ecological knowledge, social organization, and spiritual understanding that represented thousands of years of accumulated wisdom. These languages possessed grammatical structures that reflected different ways of understanding time, space, and relationship that offered alternatives to the individualistic and hierarchical worldview of European civilization. Many indigenous languages had no equivalent to the European concept of ownership, instead encoding complex systems of reciprocal relationship and stewardship that maintained ecological balance for millennia. Their spatial concepts often integrated spiritual and physical geography in ways that made the land itself a repository of cultural knowledge. The burial of these languages was not incidental to the broader project of colonization, but central to it. Communities that could not speak their ancestral languages found it increasingly difficult to maintain traditional governance systems, which relied on ceremonial language and oral tradition for their legitimacy. Legal concepts that had regulated, Land use and resource distribution for centuries became literally untranslatable, as the vocabularies that expressed them disappeared from active use. Perhaps most tragically, these languages often contained detailed ecological knowledge that would have been invaluable for sustainable development. Many indigenous communities had developed sophisticated understanding of plant breeding, water management, and ecosystem maintenance that was encoded in linguistic structures that made this knowledge difficult to translate into European languages. When the languages disappeared, this knowledge often disappeared with them, leaving later generations to rediscover through scientific research what their ancestors had already understood for centuries. Similar patterns played out across the globe. Wherever colonial powers sought to establish control over indigenous populations. In Australia, Aboriginal languages that contained 60,000 years of accumulated knowledge about survival in harsh environments were systematically suppressed in favour of English. In the Americas, languages that encoded complex mathematical and astronomical understanding were forbidden in favour of European educational systems that ignored or dismissed indigenous intellectual achievements. The burial of these languages was often justified as a humanitarian effort to provide indigenous peoples with access to modern education and economic opportunities. But the forced transition to colonial languages typically resulted in the loss of traditional knowledge without providing equivalent access to the opportunities that supposedly justified the sacrifice. Indigenous communities found themselves caught between worlds, no longer able to access their ancestral wisdom, but not yet accepted as equals in the colonial society that had imposed its language upon them. In recent decades, efforts to revive endangered languages have revealed the scope of what was lost. Linguists working with the few remaining speakers of traditional languages have discovered mathematical concepts, ecological insights, and philosophical frameworks that offer alternatives to Western approaches to knowledge and understanding. But the work of reconstruction is made infinitely more difficult by the fact that the burial of these languages was so systematic and so complete that often only fragments remain, like shards of pottery that hint at the sophistication of civilizations that time and deliberate destruction have largely erased. And so we come to the end of our journey through the burial grounds of history, where truth lies beneath layers of convenient lies and selective memory. Each story we have uncovered, from the merchant republics that proved democracy could flourish without kings, to the underground railroad of ideas that preserved beauty in the face of tyranny, reminds us that history is not a fixed narrative, but a battleground where power struggles to control not only the present but the past that shapes our understanding of what is possible. The threads that connect these buried stories are not accidental. In each case, knowledge was suppressed, not because it was false, but because it was inconvenient to those who held power. The evidence of successful alternatives to hierarchy, of cooperation across supposed barriers of race and culture, of scientific knowledge that contradicted religious authority, of diplomatic solutions to problems that were supposedly solvable only through violence. All of this was buried because it suggested that the world could be organized differently than it was. Yet the burial was never complete. In margins and footnotes, in folk songs and family stories, in the coded language of those who dared to remember what they were supposed to forget, the truth survived. It survived in the hands of scribes who copied forbidden texts by candlelight, in the voices of teachers who passed on banned knowledge to students who would carry it forward in turn, in the courage of ordinary people who chose preservation over safety and memory over comfort. As you drift towards sleep, Carried by these stories of deliberate forgetting and stubborn remembering, consider that history is not something that happened to other people in distant times and places. History is what we choose to remember and what we allow to be forgotten. History is the stories we tell about who we are and who we might become. Every day, we participate in the creation of the past that future generations will inherit, deciding through our choices what truths will survive and what alternatives will be buried beneath the accumulated weight of official narratives and convenient silences. The sleep that comes to us now is not the sleep of forgetting, but the sleep of integration, where the fragments we have gathered settle into the deeper layers of consciousness and become part of the foundation upon which tomorrow's understanding will be built. In dreams, the boundaries between past and present dissolve, and we become part of the continuing story of those who choose memory over forgetting, who insist that what has been buried can be recovered, that what has been silenced can find voice again in the eternal conversation between what was, what is, and what might yet be. Rest now, knowing that in choosing to listen to these buried stories, you have participated in the ancient act of resurrection that keeps truth alive across the centuries. Sleep, and let these recovered memories settle into the quiet spaces of your mind, where they will wait like seeds in winter soil, ready to grow when the conditions are right for their flowering. The silence that surrounds us now is not the silence of death, but the silence of gestation, where new understanding takes root in the fertile darkness of rest and dreams. Thank you for this journey. If these forgotten stories moved you, if they changed how you see the past and its connection to our present, then this journey has achieved its purpose. But these stories need your help to reach others who are seeking the same peaceful exploration of hidden truths. Your like, your share, your subscription, each one helps another curious mind discover that history is far richer and more complex than the simple narratives we're usually told. Subscribe to Fall Asleep to History for more journeys like this. 1. Ring the notification bell so you'll know when we uncover another collection of buried stories. And most importantly, share this with someone who loves both learning and the gentle descent into peaceful sleep. Sweet dreams, fellow traveler, through the hidden corridors of time, until our paths cross again in the territory of forgotten stories and recovered truths.